Hello, welcome to Weencast, Ween Off the Cuff, Riverdale, Episode 13, Season 7, The Crucible. I'm once again recording this episode on my phone because it's too damn hot to wear headphones, over-the-ear headphones, and my ears will get too sweaty, and so I apologize in advance for probably extended traffic noise in the background, but these are the conditions we live under. These neo-apocalyptic times, much like Riverdale, and thus we must make do with what we have, and what we have is Riverdale, Season 7, Episode 13, The Crucible. Yes, it's me, your Ween, and I'm here to tell you they should have called this episode The Return of the King, because you know who's back? Veronica's fucking dad. The DILF of the universe himself, Mark Consuelos. OMG. But we're not there yet. The episode begins with Jughead contemplating basically the Red Scare, except the Red Scare is happening in real time, so he doesn't say it's the Red Scare, but he's like, oh my god, a fire of suspicion. Where does it start? Where does it end? Blah, 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 blah. And Archie is writing because he thinks he can write poetry now that his English teacher told him he could, which is a delusion that happens even to the best of us. And Veronica is leaving the Pembroke. She gets in the elevator, and who should she see in the elevator but FBI Glenn? For those of you who don't recall FBI Glenn, he was Betty's boyfriend in seasons 5 and 6 when she was at the FBI, and he was a creep and a loser, and at one point her gay fake married brothers forced her to stab him, and it was a win. It was a win for everyone. And when Betty goes into her room now in this episode, The Crucible, and I know it's hard sometimes to follow, in this episode, in The Crucible, in this opening montage, Betty discovers that her mother has stolen her typewriter and stolen her phone, cut it off right at the cord. But these concerns can only get us so far because, after all, this is Riverdale. We're still in high school, and so the first thing we have to do is show up at English class. And so they're in English class. Betty and Kevin are performing a scene from Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, much to the applause of Mrs. Thornton. And sidebar, did they teach Tennessee Williams in English classes in 1955? This is the part I struggled with in this episode, because, you know, they talk about The Crucible, and they talk about Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, and Arthur Miller and Tennessee Williams were contemporary playwrights at the time. And I feel like in English class, in my experience, you don't spend that much time on contemporary authors. Also, they were edgy. They were edgy, controversial authors. That was the whole point. But whatever, it's Riverdale, am I right? And in the midst of this Tennessee Williams performance, the cops, Sheriff Kevin's dad, Principal Featherhead, Dr. Werthers, and Clifford Blossom burst into class, drag Mrs. Thornton away, and say she's basically a communist. She's suspected of communism, and she's going to be replaced for the time being by Penelope Blossom as their new evil teacher. And Clifford and Penelope lament this red menace sweeping America, and Archie asks, well, what's the dealio with Mrs. Thornton? She's not a communist. But according to the authorities, she is a communist, and thus a culture of fear develops here at Riverdale High. In the student lounge afterwards, everybody's like, gosh, what happened? I don't understand. And Veronica explains about the HUAC and Senator McCarthy and Hollywood and the blacklist. And Kevin is like, gosh, but this is America. That kind of thing can't happen. And Veronica's like, yes, it can, Kevin. Separate from all of this, Jughead and Ethel are excited about their comic, and they go to the nearest newsstand to get a copy and admire that they are finally published authors and artists. But the newsstand proprietor accuses them when they approach and tells them he's not selling comic books like that anymore because they're disgusting and un-American and perverted and freakish. And Jughead and Ethel are like, oh, okay. Cheryl is also suffering the consequences of this witch hunt. Her parents summon her to the accusing parlor of Thornhill, where they tell her that she's been reported for homosexual hysteria and that they're going to use this information to blackmail her into confirming their list of dissidents. And their list of dissidents starts with Cheryl, and then Tony, and then Kevin, and then Clay, and then I think a bunch of other made-up names. I didn't freeze frame to look at the list in detail because that's the job of people who are more into like frame-by-frame analysis than me, whereas my preference is to just blat. Cheryl, admirably, refuses to turn traitor on her friends and report them, and so her father and mother threaten her with the loss of her beloved river vixens, which is the threat that always works on Cheryl, and she's left pondering how can she betray her friends to a genuinely life-threatening accusation when she also would lose control of the cheer squad. Two equally important concerns. Veronica gets home after school to find who is in her living room but Hiram. And what is his first line? Mija! I love him. He offers her a Glamourget egg, which for those of you who don't know is the Riverdale equivalent of a Fabergé egg. And explains that he is in Riverdale because he is in trouble with Hermione because he was cheating, and also he wants to spend time with Veronica though. And so the next day, Veronica weirdly brings him to school. Kevin is a little turned on by him, understandably, because he is a massive DILF. And he mentions that unfortunately, Oh Mija, his show with Hermione, is currently on hiatus. So he's got time to come to class with them, act as the guest teacher, and provide critiques on their scene performances, because apparently their assignment this week is to perform a scene from a play. And No Eyebrows Julian tries to do To Be or Not to Be from Hamlet, and Hiram deconstructs him brutally. It's a great defeat of Julian, whom we all hate because he has no eyebrows, and also because he sucks in general. And it reminds us that Hamlet is never really the same unless it's performed in the original Klingon. After class, Betty goes to Principal Featherhead and asks if she can get a new faculty advisor for the blue and gold. Because Mrs. Thornton, accused communist, was the faculty advisor for the school paper, and now they need a new one so they can keep the club going. And Principal Featherhead's like, what if instead we just shut down the school paper? And Betty's like, but this is how we have an informed populace. And he's like, exactly, I don't want an informed populace. I want you to shut up, get out of here. And that makes sense, and that follows both the plot and the larger meaning that I believe will emerge from this season of Riverdale, is emerging, has emerged, is always perpetually in the process of emerging. Kevin, Clay, and Tony gather with Cheryl, where she explains about how their names are all on a list of sexual deviant dissidents, and they agree that they need a plan and they need to figure out who reported them. And of course, there's only one person who it just makes sense, who has it out for Cheryl, who is a homophobe, and who sucks, and that's Evelyn Evernever. So Cheryl begins to plot her revenge on Evelyn. Archie gets interrogated about Mrs. Thornton by Principal Featherhead and communism, and the thing about Archie is his head is empty and he has no thoughts. This is another great episode for KJ Apa in terms of his acting, because the guilelessness that he projects on Archie's face anytime somebody asks him about communism or Mrs. Thornton or sexual deviance, he just goes absolutely eyes wide, like it's like the Puss in Boots in Shrek, like cute kitty face. He's just like, ooh, ooh. And indeed he says, ooh, ooh, to Principal Featherhead and Dr. Werthers, though that doesn't calm them down at all, because as Dr. Werthers says, the more you teach the youth, the more they start to think that they can question their leaders and eventually question the country, and then, why, it's a thin line to civil disobedience and revolution. You heard it here first, folks. Riverdale wants you to begin the revolution immediately. After school, Hiram comes to the Babylonium with Veronica, and he decides to go watch a movie while she's working the ticket stand and the refreshments. And then FBI Glenn approaches her and asks how well she knows this Hiram Lodge. And I guess my question is, FBI Glenn, you're in the FBI, right? Shouldn't you know already who Hiram Lodge's daughter is? Why he's come to this small upstate New York town to hang out? Don't we already have this information? Whatever. Anyway, Jughead and Ethel go to the Pep Comics office, and they talk to the editor-in-chief, and he agrees. He affirms that, yeah, they're in big trouble. All the comics are getting returned. Housewives are encouraging each other not to buy the Ladies' Home Journal at any stands that sell Pep Comics. They're getting tons of hate mail that's more gory than anything they've ever published, but the editor-in-chief says they're not giving up. Whatever happens, happens. They got to go down with the ship of their vocation. And their vocation is making trashy comic books. Hell yes, brother. And Jughead and Ethel come up with an idea on how they might do some under-the-table distro of the comic books that are getting returned. Betty, enraged at the closure of the Blue and Gold, pens a fiery editorial about the oppression of teens and puts all that material into a zine, which she prints and calls The Teenage Mystique, which sounds like a magazine for pedophiles. That's Riverdale. That's Riverdale, fellas. Archie's in the garage, and he's working on his poems when Uncle Frank bursts in, and of course he tries to hide it, and Uncle Frank says, "Archie, son, you can't be writing poetry. Writing poetry is for homosexuals," basically. And he forces Archie to work on the car instead. Archie is a sensitive soul, and he just wants to share that with us. But no one takes him seriously, including me. At dinner, Veronica asks her dad about the FBI investigation, and Hiram explains, it's all a big misunderstanding. A couple months ago, he went on a trip to buy cigars and go to the Tropicana in Cuba. And, you know, he was just there to buy cigars and enjoy the tropics. But for some reason, the FBI thinks he was meeting with revolutionaries and dissidents while he was there. So he's hiding out in Riverdale until hopefully it all blows over, and he's asking Veronica to perjure herself and say she was there with him on the trip to Cuba, and he didn't do anything untoward other than buy cigars and enjoy the tropical air. But Veronica understandably is concerned about perjury. The next morning at school, FBI Glenn creepily pulls up to the school, invites Veronica to get in his car with him so he can tell her what her father is hiding. And Archie notices this weird meeting happening, and Archie wisely is concerned. And when Veronica goes with FBI Glenn, because he's like, I don't want to talk about it here, you think, oh, they're going to some, you know, like, obscure third location. But they just go to Pops. They just go and get a booth at Pops, a busy restaurant, the only restaurant. And then he shows her pictures, and he says, oh, you know, Hiram was hanging out at the Tropicana, yes, but he wasn't just hanging out at the Tropicana. He was hanging out at the Tropicana with his mistress and Cuban revolutionary leader, Vidal Maestro. Yes, everyone, that's the news. The leader of the Cuban Revolution in the Riverdale universe is named Vidal Maestro. Vidal Maestro. I'm going to say it just one more time and then we'll move on. Cuban revolutionary leader, Vidal Maestro. News reporters in America and the Riverdale universe in future decades will talk about the Maestro regime, which rules communist Cuba. People will talk about what a cruel dictator Vidal Maestro was. There will be online U.S. leftists who are like, Vidal Maestro was misunderstood. People will trade conspiracy theories about how the real father of Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau was Vidal Maestro. That's all. Inspired by the fact that he noticed the FBI creeping around, Archie goes to find Mrs. Thornton. She's packing up to leave Riverdale to go work at the Greendale Library because, they permit anything over in Greendale. They're literally witches there. But before she goes, she gives him the Crucible to read. And he's excited about it, and he's like, oh, good, because otherwise I was going to do Biff's speech from Death of a Salesman. And Mrs. Thornton says something that's actually very touching in relation to Archie. She says, well, Archie, you are a Biff type, but you're also so much more. And that's so profound. He is a Biff type, but he's also so much more. And it's in particularly profound in the Dalian context, where everyone is kind of an unwilling subject to their own archetype, inescapably. But Archie, he is a Biff type, but he's so much more. He's a special boy to me. And she also tells Archie that he's got to keep with his poetry, and he should use his words to make the world a better, freer place. Please let him be the author of Riverdale at the end of the show. Meanwhile, Jughead and Ethel have set up a little scheme in Pops where they are sitting back to back in two different booths. Kids will approach Jughead, ask for a comic issue, give him the money, and then Ethel will secretly pass the issue to him, and he'll secretly pass it to their customer. And they're doing a good trade in this. Cheryl, outside of school, confronts Evelyn, and Evelyn is basically like, yes, I hate you. I've always hated you. I want to steal the Vixens. Now I have the leverage by accusing you of being a sexual deviant and a communist. And Cheryl can't find a way out of this accusation. Luckily, Kevin, Tony, and Clay have come up with a scheme where they will lavender date each other. Clay and Tony will fake date, and Cheryl and Kevin will fake date, and that will protect all four of them, while also allowing them to hang out and be normal with their actual partners when they're together. And it does make sense, but it depresses Cheryl utterly, mainly the prospect of losing her cheerleading team. Archie ponders the Crucible, proving once and for all that yes, he does know how to read. I retract my numerous earlier statements to the contrary. Veronica stays up late waiting for Hiram, who comes back from meeting with his lawyer to explain that yes, there's no getting out of it now. He's going to be named as a communist, and he could really use Veronica's perjured testimony to get out of this. But all Veronica cares about is proof of his affair with this woman who turns out to be named Kelly, which is an excellent reference to the fact that Mark Consuelos in real life is married to Kelly Ripa, who did also cameo as his mistress in a previous season back in time, 67 years in the past and the future. And Veronica confronts him with why doesn't he just admit to the FBI that he went to Cuba to hang out with Kelly and just happened to run into communist revolutionary Vidal Maestro. But Hiram points out he has a morality clause with the studio that makes Oh Mija, so he's backed into a little bit of a corner here. And Veronica is very hurt by this because she realizes that yet again, he's really only cares about the show, not his wife or his daughter. At school the next day, Kevin and Cheryl and Tony and Clay ostentatiously fake their new romances for Evelyn's benefit, and she is enraged by the sight of them acting heterosexual when all her leverage was about their deviant sexualities. And then Archie does his scene in English class from the Crucible. And he tries so hard. KJ Apa, as Archie, puts his whole tiny walnut-sized mind into this scene. Archie's walnut-sized mind. I don't know what size KJ Apa's actual mind is. I don't know him personally. Archie's whole walnut-sized mind into the scene about the final monologue from the Crucible, where John Proctor is refusing to sign a false confession, despite the fact that it will lead to a harsher punishment for him. And he stands for the sanctity of his name. And his performance is so inspiring that Cheryl decides to confront her father and the school leaders and willingly renounces the Vixens so that they have no more leverage over her, while also mentioning the fake dating relationships that she has with Kevin, to double down on the fact that they no longer have leverage or evidence against her. And really, she made the ultimate sacrifice because she had to give up being the HBIC of the cheer squad just so her friends and herself could not be outed as gay in an extremely homophobic time. But as she and Kevin and Clay and Tony comfort each other after school, they are reminded that at least they can live their truths with each other. Archie, worn out from his epic Oscar-winning performance as John Proctor, cracks open a cold Cocorino. I don't know what the name of the soda is in Riverdale. I assume it's like a Snoke or something. Anyway, he cracks open a cold Cocorino, a cold Nuka-Cola probably, in the break room, and Veronica comes up to him and is like, "Your acting was so amazing, Archie. It really inspired me. I know what I need to do now." And he's like, "Oh, that's cool." And then Veronica kisses him a couple times, and he's like, "That's weird." And it is confusing. I don't really know what it means, why we're bringing back Varchi now. But it's Riverdale. We're bringing everything back. Jughead, now an experienced comic book dealer in one day, has a cool pair of shades and is upselling the comics by 15 cents, which leads to him getting arrested by the scout leader because he's selling to all the Boy Scouts and Sheriff Kevin's dad, and all their comics are confiscated. But Jughead and Ethel stay silly. They are happy that they got their comic out there and they made some money. They they toast to America. Uh-oh, there's a helicopter above. Okay. And while Jughead and Ethel cheerfully stay silly, tensions between Hiram and Veronica are just building. It's hard out here. Next day at school, Archie, at his locker, turns around to discover Miss Grundy is the new English teacher, and she knows that he's a great poet because she's friends with Miss Thornton, because Miss Thornton was her mentor at Mount Holyoke. A lot to unpack there, but first we have to unpack that they brought back the music teacher who molested Archie in season 1, but she's nice now, and she's like happy to be Archie's mentor, and they're not framing it as she's like a molester again. And she mentions how she has a husband and he's a poet and he's cool and he could help mentor Archie and like share some of his poems. Okay. I mean, is this in poor taste? Is it weird? However, it's Riverdale. It's in poor taste. It's weird. I mean, I can't start questioning it now when I've committed to every other bit. We don't know how it's going to pay off. Plus, I guess one thing had to be better about being 67 years in the past and the future, and I guess that's that Mrs. Grundy is not a molester. Okay. All right. Sheriff Kevin's dad and Principal Featherhead and Dr. Werther's connive in the principal's office, horrified by the continued success of the comics. Jughead and Ethel scheme to keep selling the comics, and Dr. Werther says, "Half measures haven't done enough. It's now time for," look to the camera, "full measures." And for some reason, whatever full measures is so alarming that it makes Principal Featherhead nut a little bit. So that's an evil plan underway. In English class, Veronica does a poignant speech from King Lear in character as Cordelia about, you love your father, but you struggle with your father, but it's so hard to deal with your father, which is so true. And in the end, she decides to provide a signed affidavit of her fake testimony about how they went to Cuba together to her father, but only on the condition that Hiram admit his infidelity to Hermione and sign ownership of the Pembroke over to Veronica so that she'll never have to worry about being homeless again. She had to sleep at the movie theater, Hiram. Betty goes to check the P.O. box for her teen zine, The Teenage Mystique, and discovers she's gotten a whole sack of mail of people interested in writing in and being featured in the zine. So, she's excited. I think we're going to see this zine develop in future episodes. Hiram leaves, and Hermione arrives, parent swap. She reveals that they're going to soon announce that this, the 7th season of Oh Miha, is going to be the last one, but that they're ready for something new. And they're going to not announce, but also get divorced, right? Obviously. And Hermione asks Veronica if she wants to have Christmas together, just the two of them in New York. And Veronica's like, finally, my parents care about me now that they're getting rid of each other and their show. Coda of this episode, Principal Featherhead is buying comic books off the kids, and all the kids are selling them. Jughead excluded because he immediately realizes this is some sort of scam. And indeed, that very night, they have a bonfire right outside the school where they're burning the comic books, and it's basically the Nazi book burning scene from Indiana Jones, the first Indiana Jones. The Boy Scouts are basically the SS right now, and our heroes are horrified, obviously. Next week's episode, hold on to your MF and hats, fellas, because next week is the final musical episode. And this time, it's not a musical that already exists, though it probably is a musical that Roberto wrote, because it's Archie the musical. And the premise of the episode is that Kevin and Clay have written a musical about the life of Archie, and they're going to all perform it. And based on the promo, I think Clay plays the part of Jughead, which is phenomenal. And it's going to tell the story of Archie. And I don't know if Archie is going to play himself or somebody else is going to play Archie. Anyway, it's operating on so many meta levels at this point that we just have to prepare ourselves to be utterly confronted. I think by this time next week I'll be completely bald. But I look forward to it. Thank you for your time. This has been your Ween.